Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the new year, and welcome to Havoc and Chaos Live. A weekly look at some of the batshittery we call news and the polls, pundits, and other off-the-wall people, myself included, who claim to know what is really going on in our world. I'm an atheist, a lesbian, and I have bipolar disorder. Therefore, hate of any kind is not welcome in my world. I'm opinionated, and my impulse control went by the wayside months ago. So, I say what I feel. In other words, stupid smart people piss me the fuck off. And be forewarned, I'm highly excitable, and if you are easily offended by four-letter words or longer, you may want to go listen to something else. So, recently I became involved in a discussion concerning creationism or intelligent design versus evolution, or, more specifically, the principle of natural selection. In retrospect, the discussion goes much deeper than that, but I will save that for another day. Debating such is not my forte, and I approach it from a layman's point of view. But considering I was unprepared, I think I held my own. While the gentleman, Michael was the name he gave, involved claimed to be that he was not a biblical creationist per se, he did refer to creator or creative force. His arguments were basically the standard fare presented in such discussions. Michael's fallback position, which he used prominently throughout the conversation, besides the rejection of peer review because of alleged biases against thinking outside the box, i.e., Christian persecution complex, Michael felt that natural selection does not account for the introduction of new genetic material. Well, no shit, Sherlock. If you would quit conflating natural selection to evolution, it might not be so confusing. Natural selection is only one mechanism of evolution. Like I said, standard fare. What I would like y'all to do while listening is to remember I am a layman. I'm not a scientist, nor am I a researcher. Just like y'all, I get into these discussions and sometimes flounder around trying to hold my own against individuals who have a very polished apologistic agenda. In other words, they are religious fucktards. Science, on the other hand, does not have an agenda. It's either true or it's not. You either accept it or you don't. Now, my confrontation with Michael was in essence the straw that broke the camel's back. If his research, and he actually did refer to his team, and taking into consideration an author he cited was published by the Discovery Institute, I can imagine who his team consisted of. Is so fucking brilliant and groundbreaking? Why then is he hawking his shit on a BTR program? I even asked him when his paper was published and when he was receiving his Nobel Prize, but to no avail. And as I said, this was the straw. It was time for me to become better able to counter his type of bullshit. I wanted to know exactly how bad I did and where I could improve. This segment is the result of such. This segment is the accumulation of my google-foo over the years. It is a look at specific points with what I think are solid examples to refute those points. Whether a creationist or IDer chooses to accept such evidence is a whole different story. But at least I know I'm not crazy. What was missing at first listen, though, was the tornado in a junkyard tales. It's always there. And it was, but I missed it in the beginning, as Michael repackaged the fallacy in more modern-sounding terms. He used a computer coding analogy, as well as moving the interjection of the creative force. It was an analogy I was actually unfamiliar with, and have come to learn that it's not new, and has been around for quite some time. So his claim for original thinking falls very flat. Just as with standard apologia, there is nothing new. It is just repackaged garbage. Other forms I've come across, DNA is like a computer, or DNA is like the data on a hard drive. There are others, but I think you get my drift. So today we're going to take a look at this analogy, and why it's a fallacy. And even if there was a prime mover, Michael would still have to show this prime mover's existence, which we all know is not a possibility. And even if this prime mover existed, evolution would still be true. And just to note, it was at this point that Michael abruptly disappeared from the conversation. Stan, another participant, had alluded to this point, and I was going to drive the point a bit more, but didn't get the chance. There is no question whatsoever about the truth of evolution. I think we all can agree on that. The only debates that exist about evolution are the relative importance of different forces on particular cases. So, with that said, let's take a look at the fallacy. A junkyard contains all the bits and pieces of a Boeing 747, dismembered and in disarray. A whirlwind happens to blow through the yard. What is the chance that after its passage, a fully assembled 747, ready to fly, will be standing there? So small as to be negligible, even if a tornado were to blow through enough junkyards to fill the whole universe. Originally coined by British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, it was used as an argument against abiogenesis, not evolution. It is an oversimplifying of a very complex theory, hence a straw man. Abiogenesis does not suggest that complex high-order beings appeared from primordial soup in one magical step. As an argument against evolution, it also fails, as one of the main mechanisms of evolution is natural selection, which is not random. What Michael wants to know is the initial formulation of DNA as it comes together in a system kind of way. So if I'm understanding his point of view, this is what we have. We have a computer program, which equates to ordered code. The ordered code is therefore the DNA. So he wants to know, how does DNA come together on its own? His answer is a creator. His conclusion is there had to be some intelligence behind the order and complexity of this so-called code, i.e. DNA. Now, as much as Michael likes to state that he is not speaking to abiogenesis, he is in fact making such a claim, the initial formulation of DNA. But in my opinion, I think he makes his first mistake by referring to DNA. What I think he should have said, for a better but still flawed analogy, is genome, which is the complete set of DNA, the hereditary material that makes up the genome, or the ordered code, of which DNA is part of. That aside for the moment, it really matters not in the grand scheme of things whether genome or DNA. Arguing from analogy is a bad idea, and it always fails. And instead of discussing the actual issues, intelligent design versus evolution, the conversation devolves to arguing the points of the analogy. Analogies are a teaching tool. They are for describing a difficult concept to someone who has no experience with that concept, i.e. a fifth grader, by relating that concept to something they already understand. Then they can begin to see how that concept works. But DNA cannot be placed in isolation or taken out of context. It's not a standalone piece of the puzzle. As one blogger, Smilodon, notes, it gets us into some really techy areas of chromatids, histones, and effects on replication, translation, mutations, etc. One final point concerning analogies. As with Paley's watch, the junkyard analogy is comparing a non-living object to living things capable of self-reproduction and subject to mutations. Again, referring to Smilodon, he points out there is a false analogy because watches and living things are so very different. A comparison between the two cannot be valid. It's an invalid argument regardless of whether living things have a designer or not. So let's take a little bit closer look. As noted prior, the junkyard analogy can be attributed to Fred Hoyle as an argument against abiogenesis. What was not mentioned in that brief introduction, the junkyard analogy is a statistical analysis applied to evolutionary origins. In other words, the statistical probability of life originating by chance. There are earlier iterations alluded to by the ID crowd, such as the so-called Borel's law, as well as other bad analogies. But regardless of which is used, they all fail as noted prior, because watches and living things are so very different. A comparison between the two cannot be valid. Also, It gets into the sticky wicket of probability argument after the fact. Just the fact that the fact happened screws up the probability of the fact happening, if that makes sense. Ian Musgrave, in Lies, Damned Lies, Statistics and Probability of Abiogenesis Calculations, highlights 5 problems. Now, while Musgrave goes into much more detail, his overall conclusion, the very premise of creationist probability calculations, is incorrect in the first place, as it aims at the wrong theory. Furthermore, this argument is often buttressed with statistical and biological fallacies. Remember, abiogenesis or origin of life is not evolution. They are two distinct fields, with natural selection, which is Michael's apparent issue, being just one aspect of the later. As Dr. Muhammad Noor references in my class on genetics and evolution, natural selection is one driving force of evolution. It can be one reason that evolutionary changes happen, but importantly, it is not the only reason evolutionary change happens. And he goes on. In essence, the junkyard analogy is, well, junk. It doesn't really explain what the IDers or creationists thinks it does, and it overlooks the differences between complex living organisms that are able to reproduce themselves with inanimate objects that are unable to pass on any reproductive changes. So, that in a nutshell is a more technical look at what is wrong with the junkyard analogy. But what about for us peons that don't have the science at our fingertips to counter the bullshit? What can we do besides using our google-foo? Well, 10 years ago I came across a really nice breakdown of what is wrong with the junkyard analogy. I've broken it down even further to what I call a kiss it. Keep it simple, stupid. And I kind of call it the junk of the fallacy. Random chance, single step, nothing is like it should be, and the fourth one, predetermined target. So, next week we'll take a look at what I consider 4 primary points of contention with the junkyard analogy, and how one can begin to counter the bullshit. Now back to the show and our discussion with the Fusion Triple.